She'll request to be a co-host. And it should be pretty straightforward, I think.
Yeah.
Check out. You guys can definitely keep talking for a little while.
I like the silence.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then see, no, I got it. Thank you.
That would be so wonderful. Okay. There it is.
It's under Kayla Clark.
Make co-host.
Good.
Okay,
All right, I'll use this.
thank you so much.
All right, welcome everybody. Can the folks online hear me okay? Little thumbs up in the chat will be all we need.
I can hear you, Jay.
All right, thanks, Steve. It's my pleasure to introduce Gracie Carr. I want to talk a little bit about kind of where this work came from, which will lead to how Drew and I recruited Gracie into the master's program, and ultimately kind of her voyage getting to this point. A sweet time for me, having known Gracie for many years, and also just professionally, not imagining a better candidate for kind of tall order that we teed up. That's cool. Before I do, I just want to start by saying Grace's nickname in high school was Race Car. Race Car. And I'm pleased that we're joined by Tom and Sally, her parents, today on Zoom. And they tell me that if she was a boy, her name would have been NASCAR. I don't think of that. But when I arrived here 3-4 years ago, and I started conceptualizing the idea to create natural wealth accounts in the state of Wyoming. At the time, natural wealth accounts were super apolitical of economics, and being in such a resource-dependent state, it made sense to bring this to a place where we have a relatively simple economy, but livelihoods are super intertwined with dependency. Coal, gas, petroleum, uranium, wildlife, natural, clean air, clean water, diverse forests, diverse. So this is a great place to have a romantic movie. So the Knobloch family funded this work and has for the past couple of years, and I'm pleased to be joined by another Knobloch professor, Jared, who's on the committee here supporting Grace's work. And we launched it with kind of a heavy-hitting, like high-powered technical group. We had postdocs, we had PhD students working on this stuff, launching it. Some of those are joining us today. I saw Wyon come in, Bailey Kirkland, Nino Abashidze, Ranjit Bawa, and kind of laid the groundwork for how this stuff laid the groundwork for how this stuff would be implemented in the state of Wyoming. And then the more we talked to the biologists, we talked to our agency partners, Wyoming Game and Fish Department, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to an extent, Stock Growers Association, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. The big question kept coming back. It's a cool academic exercise, but what can you actually do with it? Like, how can people use this? So we had the technical work done, but we needed someone that was afar from kind of our academic frame mindsets to come in and say, okay, what pragmatic questions can we answer? That was going to be a tough challenge for anyone, especially at the master's level. But we did a wide recruitment, interviewed a ton of people, and it kind of came down to, do we hire an economist to try to teach them the biology? Do we hire a biologist and try to teach them the economics? But also somebody that's passionate about wildlife in Wyoming that would kind of take this to heart and really want to help improve the state and how they manage resources. And we found Grace, who was the absolute perfect candidate. She came from Game and Fish as a seasonal employee. Undergrad, she studied biology, ENR, ESS, so she was a Halby to begin with. And she's from Ranchester, Wyoming, or Parkman?
Parkman.
Parkman, sorry,
No.
I was fighting words.
It's
Parkman, Wyoming. where she has, certainly a longstanding connection with the wildlife of the state. Couldn't have found a better candidate, and, certainly one that can master both the technical skills behind this work, with a pragmatic lens, actually. Couldn't be more proud to introduce Grace and hand it over to her.
Thanks, Jake, for the great introduction, and thank you all for joining me here today, both on Zoom and in person, as I defend my thesis, Wyoming Elk and Natural Wealth Composition on Private and Public Lands. So in Wyoming, we're exceptionally lucky to live amongst such a broad array of wildlife species. We can easily drive up to the Snowies and see a moose hanging out in the willows, or drive down 287 and watch the pronghorn fawns pop up spring after spring. And a lot of us know that wildlife holds some kind of value and that they're important. And we've experienced benefits from them in one way or another just through their existence on the landscape. But a crucial and yet often overlooked aspect of wildlife is the value that they contribute to human societies. Wildlife provide an abundance of ecosystem services like consumptive and non-consumptive use, biodiversity and ecological importance, as well as tourism and recreation, intrinsic value, symbolic and cultural significance. And all of these ecosystem services benefit human societies in some shape or form. But trying to conceptualize these ecosystem services in a way that's a legitimate and tangible reason to protect wildlife species or to further discuss habitat protection programs, it might be kind of hard for different audiences that may be less engaged in the discussion of wildlife. So it's not always as intuitive as we may think. And therefore, a system where nature is put into a language where we can translate it into a way where larger groups of stakeholders can better understand it is extremely helpful when discussing wildlife and land management decisions. And that's where natural capital accounting or natural wealth accounting come into play. And I'll likely be using those two things interchangeably, as well as natural asset valuation. It's all going to mean the same. I'm talking about the same concept. And it's a process in which we can characterize the value of natural resources like wildlife into their associated ecosystem services that we as humans benefit from. And so we have our form of natural capital. This is our living or non-living asset, and it generates these ecosystem services that create dependencies from humans in the form of businesses or other capitals. So think of ecosystem services. This could be clean air, clean water, coal, oil, gas, anything that we build livelihoods on. And then those livelihoods have a cause and effect with the environmental impacts for the environment that directly supports our natural assets. And so if not managed correctly, these environmental factors can cause a cascading effect that impacts the rest of the system. So by tracking our natural capital as assets or stocks over time, we can see how environmental impacts or management strategies may influence or regulate our natural asset value. And I personally really appreciate this way of thinking, because if you've talked to me for over 5 seconds, you know, I'm very passionate about wildlife. I'm very passionate about landscapes. And so being able to say, you know, these landscapes matter and these wildlife matter because they contribute a huge natural asset or natural capital value to the state is a really good way for me to translate those passions to a wider audience of people. And this brings me to my focus species. The elk, also known as Wapiti cervus canadensis, whatever you call it, it's the premier big game species in Wyoming. And they have a statewide population of about 109,000 individuals. They've been thoroughly researched and documented and managed for decades. And that actually makes them the most ideal candidate to start this kind of study off with. As with other wildlife species, elk management is heavily reliant on biological indicators like animal health, population size, and habitat quality to gauge their status. And this traditional method, while it is very useful and instrumental in understanding the species behavior, their diversity, and their environmental interactions on a broad scale, it often misses out how the health of the elk population affect the ecosystem services that us as people rely on for livelihoods. And so by utilizing this natural capital accounting method, we can fill those gaps left by biological indicators. We can connect elk populations with the goods and services that they create and that they support. So for instance, elk generate a large amount of hunting recreation opportunities in the state of Wyoming. And even though they show up as costs on the landscape, like vehicle collisions and active management, they also bring in a tremendous source of revenue through resident and non-resident application fees and licensing fees that go back into active management. And when those recreators are out on the landscape, they're out utilizing businesses like restaurants and outfitters, and even like the value they bring in with a harvested elk. All of these generate local businesses and stimulate our economy. So by looking at it this way, we can tell that this cause and effect happens with the ecosystem services, and it's tied to crucial habitat. So the crucial habitat that directly supports these elk. And they're mediated by this habitat quality and the ability for these elk populations to endure hunting pressures and keep providing these ecosystem services into the future. By looking at elk as a part of this socio-ecological system instead of separate from it, we can better understand them as a form of natural capital. And how our conservation projects that directly support the species can be framed as strategic investments, whereas the destruction of, say, their habitat creates a conservation debt that needs to be paid. So you might be wondering, where are those intrinsic values that we talked about before? And unfortunately, they're not included in our data set, but that doesn't delegitimize what we're showing here. It boils down to the data is just not there yet to show the kind of revenue that's brought in by wildlife viewing or damage, or the cost associated with damage claims or disease transmission. So this specific study, though it doesn't include those things, it's considered a very conservative approach. But the purpose of this analysis is to focus on trackable and well-documented channels of social benefits and costs that are attributable to elk populations, and they can be consistently measured over time. So the data that we did use is very robust and very reliable. In taking a natural capital approach to elk valuation, we aim to answer these three questions. One, how does crucial habitat contribute to elk population value? And where is that habitat coming from? Two, how well do traditional biological indicators like habitat and population actually show us the value of natural asset across Wyoming? And lastly, how might the model be applied to real world discussions of landowner payment methods in a hypothetical dividend payment program? Starting first with the background and building blocks that made this project possible. Dr. Wyonsue was a postdoc with Jake and Drew, and she created the first ever Wyoming Elk natural wealth accounts. And you can think of it as like tracking the benefits that we get from elk over a 40-year period. And there's various colors that represent different sources of value, like money spent by hunters who live in Wyoming and those who are coming from out of state. It covers what they spend their money on, like licensing fees, application fees, plus the value of the experience from hunting and meat value as well. Right off the bat, we can see that this like 1980s to 1990s range gets a bit wonky. It's outside the scope of this specific project to dive really deep into why that might be. We have hypothesized that it's likely because of a population change or data collection method change. But for right now, it's not going to disrupt the data that we're looking at. And so after the 1980s, from the 1990s on, we can see that the state aggregate has just been slowly increasing over time. With resident and non-market hunting experiences and meat taking up a large portion of the natural capital value, and the non-resident, non-market hunting experience and meat coming in a very close second. And I'd like to point out this comparison that we see actually a pretty significant contribution from non-residents, both down here and in this next example up top. This is my favorite one to point out, because even though per capita we have more resident hunters out on the landscape, that's how our tag allocation system works. The non-residents are actually accounting for far more natural capital value when it's directly contributed by these hunting experience or expenditures. So even though there's less of them, they're accounting for 2 to 3 times that of the resident hunter. And I think that's really important to point out and illustrate because it identifies the importance of both residents and non-residents in this overall discussion of natural capital value and what it means to Wyoming. So within that statewide view, there's individual case studies where we see variations in the appreciation or depreciation of elk herd values across 24 elk herds that were analyzed in that study. Looking up here at the top, we see that the gooseberry herd has relatively maintained its natural capital value over the last 40 years, whereas the North Bighorn herd has seen a pretty decent decrease over time, whereas Laramie, again, we're seeing that dramatic uptick between the 80s and 90s with overall increasing herd natural capital value, especially over the last 30 years. And below, we also see tremendous heterogeneity when it comes to the herd shadow prices. Because elk are not traded on the open market or in any market, they are assigned a shadow price that basically mimics demand curves for these type of commodities that aren't traded. And the shadow prices estimate the marginal value of an additional elk, which is what you're seeing here on the y-axis. That's the shadow price based on the stock or the population, which is on the x-axis. So to further break that down, whatever. Okay. So just to break this down a little bit, we're going to make up some hypothetical populations. We're just going to go with 2,000. That's not representative of these herds, but it's going to give you an idea of what these shadow values are actually showing. So at 2,000 individuals in the gooseberry population, that equates to about $8,700 per one elk. Whereas in the North Bighorn herd at that same 2,000 elk population, one elk is equivalent to upwards of $15,000. And then in the Laramie Peak herd at that same 2,000 elk population, the price per one individual elk goes up to approximately $20,000. And so the number one question that we often get is how much is an elk worth in Wyoming? One individual elk, what is it worth? And the answer is it just kind of depends. It depends on the herd you're talking about and their current population. And what this is showing is that not all herds are valued the same. Not all elk are valued the same. And that's a really important point to make going forward. And though it seems pretty simple and in its delivery, it actually has far-reaching implications for management when the individuals of the same species don't share the same value. And that takes me to my research, which taking that idea, recognizing that not all elk on the landscape are made or created equally or valued equally, I propose that the value of the crucial habitats that they depend on also vary according to the specific herds that rely upon them. So in order to do this, a variety of publicly available data sets were used to better understand the evolution of Wyoming elk natural capital value and to measure the extent to which those values were supported by crucial habitats on private lands. Starting first with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department elk crucial range data set. These are delineated specific locations defined as essential habitat components for the maintenance of elk populations throughout Wyoming. They're pulled from seasonal habitat layers, which means they might include partuition grounds and migratory routes. But by using this, we're making the assumption that the crucial habitat is one very effective way to allocate natural asset value. And because we are concentrating on these vital habitats, we're ensuring that the department's defined important land is being accounted for in our evaluation. The elk herds data set is pretty standard. We have 35 elk herds throughout the entire state of Wyoming, and this just shows their boundaries that are associated with each of them. The Wyoming private parcels data set, it comes from the Department of Revenue, and this shows very specific private parcel data. So you have your landowner ID number, your landowner name, mailing address, parcel locations, land allotments, tax boundaries, as well as legal land descriptions and assessed value. And this allowed us to look at the private side of who actually owns these crucial elk habitats and to what degree. And then recognizing that about 50% of Wyoming is public lands, both on the federal and the state level, we had to fill in the gaps left by the private parcel data. So this Wyoming Public Lands data set, it shows us BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, state land, tribal land, as well as other management jurisdictions that really gave us the full view of not only the private ownership of crucial elk habitats, but the different management types of them as well. And so to put all those data sets together and make them make a smidgen bit of sense, it was a series of geospatial processing that led us to data cleaning and analysis that led us to a hypothetical policy proposal. And this began with the integration of crucial ranges and herd boundaries with private and public land data sets to create a comprehensive outline of specific ownership of crucial elk habitats on the statewide level. The data set was then merged with the elk natural capital values and cleaned to represent public land, private land, and then the private land owned by residents and non-residents, which we were actually able to define using that private parcel data because it provided us with the primary mailing addresses, which we could then further assign as residents or non-residents based on those mailing addresses. From there, a series of statewide herd-specific pie charts were created to visualize the distribution of natural capital value by herd, by land type, and by ownership type. And a parcel level map was then illustrated to show each parcel's natural capital value share relative to the statewide aggregate. After that, a habitat and population indices were defined to illustrate where biological indicators are an accurate representation of natural capital value. And then when we attribute those asset valuations to each private parcel statewide, we based a conservative 3% opportunity cost of capital to get what we're calling the habitat dividend program. So both of the alignment indices that were developed for this study reveal how well traditional indicators predict natural asset value. This shows the difference between natural capital value based on biological indicators with the actual value that's coming from the natural capital assessments. And in regions where this alignment index, both using habitat shares and population shares to give us like two individual indices, where these alignment indices are reaching zero or getting close to zero, that means that there's a very strong correspondence between the biological indicator, again, whether that's habitat or population, and the natural capital value or natural asset share. And so on the flip side of that, a positive alignment index might be what you assume. That means that these biological indicators are overestimating the natural asset value on the landscape, whereas a negative alignment index shows that it's undervaluing that true natural asset value. So this is a lot, so I'm going to break it down a little bit. An example to better understand this would be, we'll just call this the Jackson herd, not because these numbers represent the Jackson herd, but because I bet a lot of you know where that might be located. So we're going to start there. Let's say, for instance, the Jackson herd population represents 12% of the statewide total elk population, but it represents 18% of the statewide total asset value. That's going to give us a positive 0.3. Which is what we're calling that positive alignment index. Therefore, from this number, we know that in this specific case with the Jackson herd, population levels alone will overestimate the herd's natural capital value. But say we were to flip the denominator and numerator. The Jackson herd population share now becomes 12% and the natural asset share becomes 18. This would yield a negative 0.5, which is our negative alignment index. And this means that in the Jackson herd, population will underestimate the herd's true natural asset value. And so you can see that the closer these two numbers are to each other, the closer it gets to zero. And that's where we're seeing an accurate representation of either habitat or population when it comes to the natural capital share on the landscape. So from all of that, what did we find out? I want to start off by revisiting my first research question. How is the value of natural capital from elk distributed across public and private lands? And to what extent are they owned by residents and non-residents? What we found was that public lands account for approximately $349.9 million of the elk natural capital value contained within the 23 elk herds that we studied. And private lands contribute about $160.6 million of those private lands. So what we're doing is just taking this chunk and putting it into a new pie chart that outlines residency. Among those private landowners, around $110.3 million of elk natural capital value is associated with resident-owned land, and 50.2 million is associated with non-resident owned land. So knowing that pie chart on the left, knowing that private lands only contribute 31.1% of all natural capital value compared to almost or more than double that coming from private lands. And it boils down to landowners supplying crucial habitat. We know that they do it. We've shown that they do make this very important contribution. And they're providing this tremendous value to society, and they should be recognized accordingly, and they should be reimbursed for supplying that land. And it's showing a very classic market failure where someone is providing a good or resource and they're not getting paid for it. So it's a very unique and problematic reliance that we have when we have elk, which are a public asset or public resource utilizing private property. And because of that, I do feel like this work is just that much more important, because if we weren't to analyze any of this at all, there's approximately $510.5 million associated total in natural capital value that people just wouldn't recognize. And now that we know this value, we're able to attribute it to different herds and show different trends based on the 23 elk herds that I analyzed in this research. And this table breaks that down into detail. The overview of natural capital value as it relates to public and private lands, again, further broken down into residents and non-residents. We can pick out examples like the Afton herd, which is in Western Wyoming, and it shows a distinct difference in natural capital value associated with private lands at about $0.6 million, and a heavy reliance on public lands at $7.1 million. And this highlights the significant dependence of this specific herd on United States forest land and utilizing those landscape to provide the natural capital value. And similarly, in the Jackson herd, which is located just south of Yellowstone National Park, this shows an exceptionally high natural capital value on public United States Forest Service and National Park Service land at a whopping $104.8 million. And this signifies not only the vast environmental importance of these public lands, but also the vast economic significance of the herd. And then lastly is the Laramie Peak herd. Throughout this presentation, you're going to recognize this is one of my favorite ones to talk about because they're just extremely interesting. The Laramie Peak herd in central Wyoming exhibits the highest natural capital value attributable to private lands at $42.5 million, which indicates the crucial role of private land stewardship in supporting its overall natural capital value. So knowing all of this, we chose to move on to look at the different extent in which traditional biological indicators like crucial habitat and population serve well as an indication for natural asset value. And what we did is we analyzed the habitat and population separately to yield two different maps. This first map gives us a clear picture of how habitat representation stacks up against actual economic value. And if you recall those equations that we looked at before, that's how we got to this phase. And that's how we showed this relationship. So again, we're in places we're seeing this alignment index approach 0. It's here in beige. That's where we're seeing the natural capital value being relatively correct in their estimation of, or that's where we're seeing biological indicators being a more accurate representation of natural capital value. These numbers in blue, those are underestimations, are negative numbers, and that's where we're seeing specifically habitat underestimating the natural capital value. And then on the flip side in brown, we're seeing the positive alignment index where natural capital value is being overestimated based on the habitat indicators alone. And then similarly, but not identically, this one shows the population indicators and how well it serves as the natural capital value alignment. And again, what we're seeing here in beige is that population is serving relatively correct as an estimation of natural capital value. Again, the blue, those are our underestimations, with brown being overestimations in natural capital value. And these maps, they point out, where just using habitat or just using population is a good indicator, and where it doesn't do so well. And more often than not, what we're seeing is that region to region, these herds are either being overestimated or underestimated, with a few exceptions along the way. And also by using these color-coded maps, we can quickly identify areas where habitat and population is a good predictor of value. And where it's not, and based on that, we can crack herds open and check out their history and see why they might be representing natural capital value, either over or under what's actually going on the landscape. A really good example for this is the Clark's Fork and Cody elk herds. They're very close in proximity. They're relatively the same size, yet the Clark's Fork population and habitat indicators underestimate the value held within the herd, while the Cody herd seems to be overestimated in value, or overestimating our natural capital value. So by being able to highlight these pretty quickly based on the maps, we can crack their history wide open and see why that might be. The Clark's Fork herd numbers actually explain why we're seeing this trend. They are at a historic all-time low, and this makes each elk on the landscape more valuable. And it's just like when something is rare and it becomes more coveted. It's that same concept, but with elk. These scarcity levels have actually jacked up the value of hunting tags, which is shown in our data. Yet if their numbers are to fall too low, they would have a really hard time coming back. So we're not advocating for small herds by any means, just to increase the value. But what we're showing is why we're seeing these differences in herds that are relatively close in size and location. And then on the other hand, the Cody herd, it's been able to maintain this higher population. We have some crazy things going on between 1990 and 2010. They're fallen with the rest of us in the recession in 2008. But, overall, they're maintaining this population between 4,000, 6,000 level. And because of that, they're bringing in more hunting related revenue due to tag allocations, and their hunting quotas are higher. And so in order to match this population level. And so that's why we're seeing the overestimation in the Cody elk herd. Another really, really interesting case study again with the Laramie Peak herd. What we're seeing here again is that the Shirley Mountain herd, their habitat and population indicators are overestimating their value, while the Laramie Peak herd is being underestimated. This one's specifically looking at the habitat indicator. The Shirley Mountain herd has a smaller crucial range, but it's still going to be pretty comparable. And so this is our habitat indicator, and this is our population indicator. So it does slightly switch. Shirley Mountain again is overestimated, but the Laramie Peak herd, what we're seeing here is that population is a relatively good indicator of natural capital value compared to habitat. So let's figure out why that is. Again, we're looking at the population charts over the last 40 years, and they're both increasing over the last, since 1980, they've been increasing over time, but it's the population that they're currently at is the reason why we're seeing that overestimation versus underestimation. And as you can see, the population level in the Shirley Mountain herd is significantly lower than that of the Laramie Peak herd, which doesn't mean that it's automatically going to trigger that small herd, high value. That's not the case here. So it's actually different than what we're seeing in the Cody herd. But what we're seeing is because of this small herd, there's less hunting tags, therefore there's less revenue associated with the Shirley Mountain herd. Whereas the Laramie Peak herd is wild. It's growing anywhere from 200 to 14,000 individuals. And the Game and Fish is just cranking out hunting tags. And the Laramie peak herd does not care. They are just, they keep growing. And I find this absolutely fascinating. And from before, we know that the Laramie peak herd has a very heavy reliance on private property to maintain and support the natural capital value that's associated with it. And so though this large herd is bringing in a ton of hunting revenue, and it's really great for anyone looking to go out and bag an elk, at this population size, it's likely causing a lot of wildlife conflicts with private landowners, and it can become a really big problem. And the increased damage claims that come from the gathering tendencies of these elk and the overall nuisances that they cause, because they can just decimate a whole bunch of forage in a very small amount of time, depending on how many of them are on the land. What we're seeing is increased private landowner problems. And so this giant herd is not just a concern to those landowners that are trying to create profitable lands, or, trying to support whatever it is that they produce, whether it's animals or crops, but it's also a concern with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, because they're in charge of mitigating those issues. Which is actually a really good segue into my third and final research question. How might natural asset valuations be used to create a habitat dividend program that replaces landowner hunting tags and damage claims? And wildlife and private land conflicts, they're not unique to Wyoming. It's a widespread thing. And many states have systems that benefit landowners for contributing habitat that they provide and damages that they may incur. So there are programs in place. Depending on the state, it varies tremendously. For instance, in Wyoming, if you own 160 contiguous acres with 2,000 animal use days, this qualifies the landowner for a priority hunting license draw. I want to point out these hunting licenses are not free. All the landowner gets is the priority draw in limited quota areas. And so these eligible landowners that receive these tags, they get 2 non-marketable, non-transferable big game licenses per species. And also unique and kind of interesting to Wyoming is the carcass coupon, or the landowner coupon program, which compensates landowners $16 from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department for each elk, deer, pronghorn that's harvested on their property. Why they do $16 as a reimbursement? Well, I don't know. I can't find how they reached this number. I don't know why an elk is valued the same as a pronghorn. And for me, that's just all the more reason why my research is that much more important, is because we offer evidence-backed valuations of private habitat contributions to the public's wildlife asset. And it's something that's never been implemented in Wyoming or anywhere else. And so that's where our analysis aims to fill those gaps. We identify a fair market analog to a dividend paid to landowners who own crucial habitat and support the creation of natural capital value. And we offer a novel and theoretically grounded approach to landowner compensation. So similar to how landowners get paid for putting like wind turbines up on their property, they get paid a rental, like essentially a rental rate for providing the land in which the turbines go up on that create a benefit to society in the form of energy. It's that same concept, but we're looking at crucial habitat provisions instead. So landowners would essentially earn a yearly dividend as a rental for those lands that support wildlife value. And instead of a private energy company coming in and paying the landowner, it would likely be management agencies who have to provide that compensation. And so we're suggesting a conservative 3% annual capital yield payment, which is pretty standard in cases like this. However, there's not much precedent for this specific dividend program, because I certainly haven't heard of anything like it before. And because of this, it's more of like a policy prototype, and it would need to be further fine-tuned by lawmakers and wildlife managers. So the proposed system, what we found from our analysis is that 6,583 households would receive some kind of payment for providing crucial elk habitat. And that's approximately 2.8% of all Wyoming households. And just like wealth often pools in a few hands, the biggest benefits from this program would go to a small number of households. And because of this, when I show you the cumulative distribution functions that were created, we had to break them into low, medium, and high payments, because if not, the graph gets very janky and it's very hard to understand. So we broke it into these low, medium, and high dividend payments, and we're showing them as those cumulative distribution functions. And what we're showing total is that $4.9 million would be going to landowners. And of those private landowners specifically, $3.3 million would be getting paid to residents and $1.5 million would be going to non-residents. Starting out with our low-level dividend payment category, which accounts for 5,464 households and ranges anywhere from $1 to $500. A good way to look at these kinds of charts is we have 80% of people pointing. Go over to this where that line intersects. So approximately 80% of 5,464 people are going to be receiving a dividend payment at or below $100 every year. The mid-level payment category ranges anywhere from $501 to $10,000, and it accounts for 1,021 households, where about 60% of these households would be getting a dividend payment at or below $2,000, with about 20% of them receiving somewhere between the $6,000 to $10,000 range. The last one is the high-level annual dividend payment category. What's really interesting about this graph is you have our curve, and you guys, hopefully you can see that there are these individual notches along these curves. The fun part about this graph is that those individual notches represent the 98 different households. So what we can do based off of the previous data that I found before, I know exactly who these people are. I have looked all of them up. I know their land sizes, their mailing addresses, quick Google search. I know their net worth. It's kind of scary how much public information is out there, but it shows just how neat this is. And it shows these 98 households ranging anywhere from $10,000 to $1,885,283, which is the highest possible dividend payment program, or the highest one that we found. So we know all this, very interesting, but what good is any of this analysis if we don't actually have the money to pay the landowners for the provisions of crucial habitat? So I propose a very hypothetical solution to this problem. Again, keep in mind, this is a hypothetical solution. Okay, I'm not proposing any type of policy, but this is rather just how the model can be applied to these real world discussions. And what we need is $4.9 million annually. We need to generate this revenue somehow. And so I propose that we layer it into existing hunting licenses and application fees. And so specifically focusing on non-residents, I propose that we increase their $15 application fee by $20. And just by doing that, we would be receiving over $800,000 in profit. It was assuming that this non-resident hunting volume remains somewhere around 23,000 individuals. So after increasing that application fee, we also increase the licensing fee for non-residents. So this is what they're currently paying at $768. I propose we increase it to $1,115. And you might be saying, hey, why is all this going to non-residents? And they're going to stop hunting here. But we've created such a unique hunting opportunity in this state. People want to hunt here year after year. And we oftentimes have an abundance of applications and people who don't get tags because of the current allocation system. So we don't assume non-residents to just stop hunting here altogether. In fact, at this current licensing price, it's far more comparable to what non-resident tags in Montana cost at $1,048. What we do anticipate, or what we could expect from something like this, is Given these current payments, we would expect landowners to now be incentivized to provide crucial habitats and conduct habitat improvements, which could increase the elk population health and increase total hunting capacity and revenue generating capacities in this industry. So even if application fees drop off a little bit, we expect an increasingly attractive hunting opportunity, which is the supply side from the elk, to offset the demand side from the effects of the increased licensing and application fees. Which brings me to my conclusion. The study introduces a new integrated modeling approach that helps in diagnosing the reasons behind the appreciation or depreciation in natural capital value. This provides a more nuanced understanding of wildlife management and conservation economics. We developed a policy application that supports landowners who provide crucial elk habitat. This framework helps to craft policies that are not only environmentally sound, but also economically viable, which ensures their sustainability in the long term. The research advances the concepts of viewing wildlife populations as natural assets, which is a shift from traditional conservation approaches that primarily focus on biological indicators. This could lead to new valuation methodologies and recognizing that the economic contributions of wildlife to local and regional economies. Some possible applications. This method and model developed in this study serves as a template for other regions that want to assess the value of their wildlife populations. This could be particularly useful in regions looking to develop similar conservation strategies and economic valuations. The study paves the way for a more informed and sustainable conservation practices and programs, and these are designed to manage human and wildlife conflicts more effectively and promote new conservation actions, which address both the local and broader ecological challenges. Brings me to my thank you section.
All of them.
So,
Thank you so much, Gracie.
should I thank everyone or not? To my committee, to Jared Merkel in the back, thank you for providing some really great insight throughout this project. Your knowledge was pivotal in understanding the entire scope of elk valuation, and I really appreciate the help that you provided. Dr. Drew Bennett, thank you for your time, your constant dedication throughout this project. I really couldn't have completed it without you and the Macmillan group, who constantly are just encouraging me to be better and do better, both academically and professionally. So thank you for all your hard work. Jake. Thanks, boss. For some reason, you got a wild hair and you hired a biologist as an economist, and I am very lucky that you chose me, because you have just become such a great mentor to me. You've shown me immense patience in this entire learning curve, and yeah, I'm very thankful for your time and all your help and just being an inspiration to me. That's not sarcastic. And then finally, thank you to my friends and who have supported me and encouraged me and always made my day a little bit better when things got kind of dark, which the last few months, if you haven't done a master's program, they get a bit dark. And so I'm very thankful for you guys. And lastly, to my family, my mom and dad, for their constant support, my granny, who's not on here and would hate if I showed her picture to everyone, as well as my little tiny emotional support nephew, who was born in just the right time for me to take advantage of all his little cuteness. And then lastly, to my great husband, who probably took the brunt of this educational endeavor. He reminded me to drink water, get outside in the sun and walk around, and that Diet Coke is not a meal. So thank you so much. I love you. All right.
Good job, Gracie. Yeah, we'll follow the standard structure, public comments, questions, let her have it, people from Zoom. After that, but
Okay. We'll start with you.
Okay, so I'm a nurse, so take this with a grain of salt. I think I understood everything.
Okay.
Okay, so why is the gooseberry herd staying consistent in their elk population, but North Bighorn is decreasing and Laramie Peak is increasing?
That's a great question. I think, well, if I would have included the population levels over the last 40 years, that might explain why those values are increasing and decreasing. Off the bat, I don't know the answer to that question, but the fact that you can see the differences in each of those herds and see that something is going on, those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking when investigating herds further. And so it could be population value or population that's bringing in more hunting revenue. Maybe the North Bighorn herd for some reason is dropping off in popularity. And I don't know why the North Bighorn herd is quite beautiful and people want to hunt it, but why specifically those three herds are showing the trends that they do, I'm not sure, but we do have the necessary background information to figure out why that is.
In one slide, you'd mentioned that there would be potentially non-resident compensation, correct? Was that, or maybe I was misunderstanding that. How is that organized and how would that be allocated, I guess, and where does that compensation come from? Like from the money that people are putting in for hunting licenses and tags and such, and kind of how would you work with that?
Yeah, I think so. I might have misrepresented what's going on. That when I say non-residents, we are looking at non-resident landowners.
Okay.
So the people who are actually owning these crucial landscapes and supplying this resource, they are included in these dividend payments. So both in-state and out-of-state residents are included.
Yeah, okay.
Gracie, I really thoroughly enjoyed your talk. You answered most of my questions with it, so really appreciate that. We beg you to come get a PhD with us. I have two questions that you don't really have to answer.
I love that.
That's type of question.
But I've been really interested in this Laramie Peak herds for a long time, and I've talked with Jake a lot about this, but I'm really interested in the implications of access between the land types, and then how restrictions to access reflect. Could you reflect those in could you figure out what those are in your shadow prices? And if so, well, first of all, do you think access drives up the shadow price? And do you think and this is where you don't have to answer this, but do you think it's just like fake scarcity? And if so, does that mean that those people people's the wrong word, those situations with restricted access, should they actually get the full kind of dividend that you're talking about?
Okay, I will do my best to tackle these questions. Okay, so the first one is looking at access, the access implications in this part of the state. And it's not well shown, but this is the Iron Mountain herd down here. And what I recognized as an access yes technician is that a lot of the southern portion of the state, they are opening up their land to access. They're utilizing that access yes program. And so I think the increased herds certainly open up more access opportunities because of these landowners trying to mitigate the issues that they're having. And then whether or not that drives up the value, Jake might be able to better understand this, because the access yes program is not funded by the licensing sold specifically. I believe it's like you have to donate to it. It's run off donations. So how that plays into this model, I'm really not sure. I would like to say that increased access increases the desirability of the herd, which therefore increases like the amount of tags sold in that area. And then more animals being harvested because more hunters on the landscape. I would like to say that it increases. And I think I answered your questions, and if not, please tell me where I can circle back around.
And it's modeled explicitly that way. So the share of public land within a herd's extent finds its way into the actual demand curve to predict the hunting applications and licenses. So access, yes, when a private landowner opens up their land would essentially be an extension of accessible land. So I think your idea of artificial scarcity is probably the case, that you've got a ton of animals, but if you can't access them, what's the use of having them?
Cause that's where I just feel like the signal is probably messed up, cause they're definitely overpopulated.
Yeah, and that's just the whole southern part of the state is just tough because you have a lot of BLM land and a lot of it's landlocked. And so those landowners have to open up access opportunities, and a lot of them will utilize the fact that they are exclusive, not landowners to that private parcel, but they're like the exclusive access. And so they have a tendency to get outfitters, and they tend to, jack up the rate and have people come on their land explicitly to hunt those herds. So it's a really interesting question, and one that I would absolutely love to plug in and see what happens.
Well, just quick follow-up, are the dividends annual or one-time payments?
They would be annual. Yep. So these landowners would be receiving whatever their allotment is every single year. And so for some people, it could be a lot of money, but for others, it's a pretty modest amount.
It's like, that's the interesting thing to me, and this is where I can never get my mind around the shadow price concept. In my mind, those shadow prices are basically kind of like a capitalized value of that elk. So that elk, you had it, it's what it is for value then and whatever it generates in the future. Right? That's kind of how, again, this is where you don't have to answer. But I have if that's the case, so it's this capitalized value, then whether it should be equated to an annual flow kind of payment like this, or like a one-time boom, I don't know. Have you thought about that? You don't have to
I think-
answer. I don't-
I'm just thinking, yeah, these are definitely marginal values of the elk based on the population in it. What I think you're saying is that like the populations don't change dramatically from year to year. So should those dividend payments be like a one-time thing or reevaluated more frequently? And in my mind, I want to say that the annual dividend payment makes more sense because they are supplying that crucial habitat year after year, regardless of the population. So if all of a sudden those shadow prices went way up, they're still providing the same amount of land. But if they go way down and that herd is not valued as high, then I think those dividend payments should be based on the land allotment, not necessarily the shadow price or that marginal value per one.
Awesome. Come in a PhD, fully funded, in fact, we'll double funded.
Thank you. Corey, I saw you. had a
I
question.
do have a question, but I also want to be sure that we're okay on time. Can I ask one question? Or-
Oh, yeah, we're good.
Okay, all right. This was awesome. Really fun to hear your work and really exciting to see what you've done. And I was just curious, it's a curiosity about trade-offs. So it seemed like at one point you said that currently landowners get paid for like damages or other things. How do those payments compare to the payments that you're suggesting, and what would be the trade-offs? Because I'm just wondering, for some of those low people, that are on the lower curve, are they actually getting more now than they would be in the future?
Yeah, and that's the hard part to understand is that those damage claims aren't included in our model because of being able to attribute specific payments or damage payments with the herd that caused the damage is really difficult. And so I think how it would compare, I believe we talked about this, and correct me if I discuss it wrong. But if we include those damage claims, the price that we're paying landowners would actually go down. And because of that, I think even though these landowner dividend payments for some people seem low, they're still being paid retroactively. So they're being paid before the damage is happening in, with hindsight, thinking that's how that would turn out. But yeah, we would be paying landowners regardless of if they're incurring damage. And I like that part about this model, how it actually compares to the current dividend payments that are being paid on a herd specific level is a bit hard to understand right now.
Just curious, yeah.
It's a good question and one that I've thought about a lot. So thank you for asking. Jared.
Curious on the third part, how you guys came to this idea that to charge the license fees to get this dividend number. And the reason I ask that is because isn't the licenses and their fees just a very tiny part of the wealth of an elk or the asset of an elk? And so I'm curious, like, what brought you guys to that conclusion to go here when I don't know, it's like a small part of the wealth or the whatever
Yeah,
asset is.
that makes sense. I think what drove us to come to this conclusion and approach it in this way is that these payment methods are already being implemented. So it would be relatively easy just to layer on a higher fee to reach that dividend payment. So it was most out of feasibility for the department. They didn't have to create a separate program, ask for donations. It's convenient because it could just be added on to the already existing application and licensing fee. So I think feasibility for the department as well as just convenience kind of led us into this direction on how we would actually pay those dividend payments. It's only one way in which this model could be used. We could certainly, try to track down this money elsewhere. It's just one applicable way in which we could try to generate the revenue necessary for those dividend payments.
And would that difference, that 768 to 1,115 plus the 831,000 add up to 4.9 million?
Yes.
It's a big difference.
I would say I like your idea of doing this because you're actually making the people, your model is tracking their value. So you're making them pay for the public good that other people are generating. So I like that model.
And I'm not specifically focusing on non-residents to pick on them. They're very important when generating natural capital value. But what happens is they are utilizing a Wyoming resource and they do not reside here. And I think that it's important that, it's an important way to look at it, is that they are paying their dues to utilize our resources. And I think that's a really important way to frame it.
I think it speaks to the political feasibility as well. If you tag this onto resident hunting quotas, what would happen in the state? People would lose their minds. But non-residents is political. I mean, at some point you can have analysis, you can have efficiency, but political implementation is really the key here, and that's where framing I think becomes really clever.
It's exactly what Don Dutton would do. So.
I am John Dutton.
You really are.
Any final questions before the committee has some time with Grace?
Grace.
Any in there? It's awesome. Awesome. All right, thank you. It's recorded, yeah.
All right, everyone on Zoom, thank you so much for coming. I'm gonna hand the Zoom meeting.
Yeah, congrats. Let's wait to yeah, that's awesome. Great.
Thank you so much for coming.